welcome to podcasting, the current big thing with Nancy Solomon. Nancy Solomon is a senior reporter at WNYC, the public radio station and NPR affiliate in New York. She has covered New Jersey for NPR and WNYC since 2001 and was the editor and manager of the team that won a 2014 Peabody Award for Christie, White House Ambitions and Abuse of Power. Her latest project is the podcast Dead End, a New Jersey political murder mystery. Please join me in welcoming Nancy.
Thanks, Nishi. Thanks everybody for coming. So, I've been an audio journalist for a good many years, I guess going on about 30 years. And podcasting came along in roughly about, I think it started up sometime around 2006, but really took off in 2009. And now radio stations and radio news is going through the same kind of transformation and kind of depression that newspapers and magazines went through starting about 20 years ago. So now those of us who work in radio are looking to podcasts as the hope of our profession. And if and I believe that will happen. And the reason I think podcasts are so popular, well, I have to say, I'm obviously a dyed-in-the-wool audio journalist, so I love making audio stories that are for the ear, that are not for TV, not for film, not for the printed page, but something that you listen to. And I think the reason why public radio became so successful in telling news stories and all kinds of stories um, over the last really 50 years, it became so successful because it really is a unique medium in which you you don't see any imagery, so you're hearing the voice of characters, you're hearing people described, you're hearing places, and you're hearing those places described by the narrator. And what that does is it really engages your mind and engages your imagination. And so I think people connect to audio storytelling in a way that is unique to audio storytelling and is very powerful. And it's why I love it so much. I love it as a listener and I love it as a maker. Um, so I think podcasts are kind of the next and current thing that really grows out of public radio, even though there are all kinds of podcasts that have nothing to do with journalism, have nothing to do with audio storytelling. There's, a zillion and one interview shows. So, but I think it's also becoming the place where the kind of audio storytelling and journalism that I've been engaged with all these years is like this is our format now, and this is the potential of where we can grow. I think one of the statistics is that people under the age of 35 don't own a radio. So there is, there's still radios in cars, but some car makers are stopping making them. And, for me, I don't even listen to the radio in my car so much anymore. I plug in my phone and I listen to what I have on my phone. And I think that's what makes podcasts so powerful is that you can listen to any program that you want on demand. And I think, for young people, maybe you just consider that like the water, the air that you breathe. But for those of us who grew up in an era of like a few TV stations and a few radio stations, and you had to listen to what was on at that time, on demand listening and on demand consuming of media is it's really fairly new. And so it's one of the things that's making podcasts so popular and such a powerful force in the sector is that is you have on-demand listening. And as I mentioned, you have it's on your phone, so it's with you wherever you go in a way that a radio never, most radios weren't. I mean, some people tote them around, but mostly people don't. So you get out, you listen in the car, you get out of the car, you walk the dogs, you have it, you can just continue to listen. And it'll stop and pick up where you left off, just like Netflix does. And so that also makes it a very powerful medium. And so it's all of these elements to podcasting that I think are powering the growth in the sector. Um, and it's the growth of podcasting that is also its biggest problem because when it exploded and there were just there are and have been so many podcasts that it is overwhelming. You can't figure out what to listen to next sometimes, or you can't find the things you want. Um, and of course, if you're a maker of podcasts, it makes it much, much more difficult to find your audience when people have literally a million podcasts to choose from. So I think um, and I'll talk a little bit more about how to find an audience in a few minutes, but I think the struggle to, build an audience and keep that audience is just very, very difficult, very challenging. And I think that's why we're seeing, I mean, uh, public radio stations and the national public radio networks and the private companies like Gimlet. I mean, there's just been a lot of retraction and shrinking of the maker space because the market was glutted and advertisers weren't getting the return on their investment from podcasting, and so advertising has is gone down, and venture capital support has gone down, and so what there's been a real retraction in the podcasting market the last year and a half or 2 years. And so that's a real problem, but I think ultimately ultimately we'll get there. I think it's too great of a medium for it to just, not succeed. I often think about, like for me as an audio journalist, making a podcast, particularly a long form narrative podcast, um, is basically the equivalent of a newspaper reporter writing a book. You spend your career cranking out these, shorter stories that are often you have to do them in the same day that the news happens. But even if you have a week to work on something, you've got a real time and space constraint on what you can say and how much research you can do and how much of the story you can tell. And a podcast is like a book, it's just there is no limit. So um, even though I think we've come to understand that 20 to 25 minutes is kind of the sweet spot for an episode. Although there are certainly, I mean, Joe Rogan's has the largest audience in the country, probably the world, and he does 3 hour long podcasts. So there are no rules, but a 20-25 minute episode is kind of the perfect amount of time where you can listen to it while you're doing the dishes or while you walk the dog or on your trip in your car from point A to point B. It doesn't take a huge amount of your day to consume one episode and then you're ready to move on to the next one the next time you have a couple of, a few minutes. So, but it's really, you could do so many episodes that's like, for me, that was the joy of making a podcast was being able to really dig in and tell a story exactly how I wanted to tell it with no time constraints. In radio, we have time constraints. In print, you have, space constraints. Um, And so that's a real benefit. Um, so what makes a podcast good? Well, I think I think mo my opinion is that it's good characters and character development. You hear somebody and you attach to them and you want to know what they have to say, what they're going to do, what they find out. Oftentimes, that person is the narrator going and taking you on their journey, um, and a sense of place. I've been working in New Jersey now for the last 20, almost 25 years. And it's such a great place to tell stories, particularly if you're a political reporter. There's just so many characters and so many things going wrong. And that it's just, and great accents. And, it just like, I just love placing us, having a story that you just feel it, you hear it's very, everything about it is New Jersey. So that's kind of my goal, is to develop characters and to develop a sense of place, and that's what helps you create a strong narrative, that propels a story forward, and keeps people listening, because that's the name of the game. So I thought I would tell the story of my podcast that came out in 2022. And it's called Dead End, a New Jersey political murder mystery. And this really is, for me, like the thing I'm most proud of in my career. And I'm getting to the end of that career. So that's saying a lot. And so in 2019, I had a fellowship with ProPublica, which is a investigative reporting, nonprofit investigative reporting news outfit. And they had these grants for local reporters to work on local stories, and you would get bought out of your salary for a whole year, so that you could work on the project all year long and have no demands from your newsroom. So in 2019, I pitched to them and they accepted. And the idea for the project was, we called it The Real Bosses of New Jersey. And it was meant to be a sort of expose of the political bosses that really run and control politics in the state. I never moved off of my first sort of target of my investigation, which is this man named George Norcross, who controlled and controls still today politics in the whole southern part of the state, about 4 or 5 different counties all put together, all centering around Camden. And I expected to sort of do a story about him and then move on to other counties and other party bosses. And it took me all year, and I just kept finding one story after another story after another story about George Norcross. So really, the whole year was spent working on him and corruption in Camden. And the stories were often, most of the stories were about like corporate tax breaks and corrupt real estate deals and things that were very like document heavy stories. And they just did not lend themselves to either good radio or the kind of story that lands well where people get really into it. Like, for instance, I worked on our team that did all of our Bridgegate coverage. And that was a story, we people sometimes use the word sticky, but that was a story that just, for whatever reason, and I'm not even sure I can say what that reason is, people loved that story and wanted to know everything about it, wanted to always read it, wanted to listen, whatever the format was. And so there was something about, the fact that this very colorful governor would stop traffic on the world's busiest bridge to punish a political rival who wasn't even a political rival. I mean, that was the crazy thing about it. He just was a Democrat who wouldn't endorse the Republican for reelection. And so he got, the mayor of Fort Lee got punished. And so that story like really took off. And so now fast forward to 2019, I'm doing all these stories about George Norcross, And they just don't seem to be having that kind of traction, and it frustrated me. So the year ends, and and sometime maybe over the summer or in the early fall of that year, um, in my reporting on George Norcross, I come across a story about a couple that I was well aware of, and well aware that they had died mysteriously, and that their deaths had never really been explained, and everything that I had read about their deaths at the time, which was in 2014, was just didn't make sense. Like, it just, the descriptions in the newspaper of like what police detectives were saying just like didn't sound like they were real. No one ever felt like they got a satisfying answer to what had happened to this couple. And so in the course of my reporting, I discover a connection between this couple who had been murdered and the corruption that I was investigating on the Camden waterfront and this real estate deal. So we go ahead and we publish the story about the real estate deal, and we just mention that this guy turned up dead at the end of the story, but we don't go into it at all. And so then the year ends and the project's over, and I had an opportunity to apply for Frontline, which makes documentary films for public TV, put out a request for people to pitch ideas for a podcast. And I thought, oh, now here's the perfect way to tell this story, because true crime podcasts are really popular, and they have a certain amount of suspense with cliffhangers at the end of every episode, and I love listening to them. Many people, they're some of the most popular podcasts out there. And I thought, well, what about if I told the murder story as a way to hook the audience and then get into the tax breaks and the real estate deals and the corruption on the Camden waterfront? And, I thought, okay, one of two things is going to happen. Either I'm right, and I'm going to successfully hook listeners, and they're going to like come along with me on this journey, or I'm wrong. And when I get to episode 4 and I start talking about the corruption deal and leave the murder investigation, I'm going to like royally anger the audience and they'll stop listening. And I really wasn't sure which it was going to be until the podcast came out and we watched the numbers grow. And in fact, listeners really did want to stay with the story, and they followed right along. And once they were hooked, they wanted to go on that journey to hear about the corruption case, and the corruption investigation. So it was a great success. We had, like 3 million downloads, which is pretty good for us public radio people. Um, and, maybe not Joe Rogan numbers, but we were very happy with that. Um, and and that's the story of Dead End. So um, I think in there, I wanted to talk about how, if you have a podcast idea, how to pitch it. And I think in that story, it's instructive. Like, you have to think about how you're going to tell a story and how you're going to maintain the audience's interest in your story, how you're going to hook them, and what it is, what's the story that you're telling, and what is the audience for your story. And we thought that the audience for the podcast was going to be mostly New Jersey and New York local listeners, but in fact we had strong numbers from all over the country, which I think is somewhat, is it shows the power of the true crime format. Really is powerful, and people really like them a lot. And so, we were able to grow the audience with that. So, but anyway, so if you have an idea for a podcast and you want to try to get it made, um, you have to think about who your audience is and who's gonna pay to make this podcast and who's gonna distribute it. Like, those are the two big things you have to figure out. Um, and there are many different kinds of podcast producers. So you have public radio stations and public radio networks, like not just NPR, but there's PRX, there's the network that makes Marketplace, which is called American Public Media, I think. Um, and of course, there's NPR. There's television stations. Like one of the most popular podcasts on the market is Dateline has a podcast that people love. So television stations, newspapers. The New York Times has gone gangbusters into podcasting and doing a terrific job of it. Um, I recommend Ezra Klein. I think that's a great, and that's a, a conversation and interview podcast, but I think it's terrific. Um, and then newspapers, I mean, not just the Times, but, NJ.com and newspapers all over the country are making podcasts. And I think I mentioned TV networks. So, and then you have private production companies that make their for they're pretty much for profit. They make a podcast and they put the money up front to get it made, and then they sell it to a distribution company. At the distribution company sells advertising and puts basically like publishes the podcast and pays the production company for having made it. So for instance, Pineapple Studios makes a lot of high quality podcasts. And then, but you don't listen, you don't go to Pineapple Studios to listen to it. You then a distributor like Wondery or Spotify or Audible picks up these podcasts that are produced by production companies, and then they're the ones who put them out onto the platforms. So that's the economic model for podcasting that's like the private sector. Public radio doesn't function that way. It raises money through grants and members and then invests that money in making podcasts. Um, and then let me look at my notes. So you've got to figure out your intended audience and who would be interested in listening to the podcast. And then by understanding who's going to listen to your podcast, then think about, so what does that mean in terms of who would distribute this podcast? What kind of is it going to be something that would easily be able to sell advertising? Like there are a million niche podcasts about things that people are really super interested in, that are just their thing. And there are podcasts that are just about these like very niche things, but they are very successful because they have advertising, because the people who are listening to the podcast are the obvious market. I'm trying to think of a good example, but um, I'm blanking on any example because I don't listen to this type of thing. But um, it could really be almost anything. It could be about flashlights, which I happen to have a family member who's obsessed with flashlights. And it could literally be that niche and that specific. I heard an interview with this guy, Hank Green, who has a very popular podcast that is distributed on YouTube. And and he talked about the fact that like the way he has become successful is that he is obsessed with his traffic numbers, and he just pays a super amount of attention on what does well, and then he does more of that. Um, so I guess that's kind of obvious, but um, so to pitch a podcast, you've got to be able to go to a production company and say, what's the podcast about? Who's the intended audience and why do they want this? Um, if it's a story and a narrative kind of a podcast, how are you going to get this story? How are you going to, like, if it's a journalism, how are you going to go out and report it? How are you going to get the information you need? And what format are you going to use to tell it? How long will it take you to produce it? How much will it cost to produce it? And you need, let's say for something I would work on, we need a host, we need a reporter. Sometimes, like in Dead End, it's one and the same. I was both the host, the reporter, and the producer for my podcast, but sometimes you have separate people for all those things. You need a sound designer who has music, writes music, and mixes your final product and puts the music into it. Um, you need an editor, you need a fact checker. It's good to have a lawyer if you can afford one. So maybe not for every subject, but certainly when you're investigating somebody and accusing them of being corrupt, you really need a lawyer when you're doing that. Um, all you put together basically a proposal that has all answers all of these questions and go to a podcast production company or a public radio station and try to interest them in your idea. Um, so then wanted to mention developing an audience. Um, you know, my experience with Dead End was really great because we had many of these shows have been cut, sadly, because of the economic times and the problems we're having with funding. But at WNYC, we had a whole podcasting unit called WNYC Studios. And in that stable of podcasts, they were all being produced and run by WNYC. So it was very easy for me to get my podcast promoted on the other shows that we produce. So Radiolab, On the Media, Death, Sex, and Money. Trying to think, there were a few others, but so we were able to get promotion on other podcasts that drove people to ours. And then our audience development team made some trades with external organizations producing podcasts that we thought would have the kind of audience that we were going after. So, for instance, a true crime podcast, and we would trade with them. So we'd put their promo in ours, and they would run our promo. And so I think that really helped to, you've got to, I mean, this is the challenge. You've got to find people and interest them in your story. And there aren't that many ways to do it, but and one of them is either paying for advertising on other podcasts or getting trades, and we went the trade route, and it was very helpful. Um, Social media, of course, is great. It's sort of rapidly changing, but I think it still helps and works to get your message out. Um, and and then as I mentioned, I think for niche markets, you have if you have a very, very specific audience, it helps you because you can you know how to find people because you're talking about a very defined group, uh parents. So you know that if you um reach out to parenting organizations or advertise in newsletters and and other podcasts about parenting, you can target much more effectively if you've got some kind of niche subject matter that you're dealing with where you have a very easily defined audience. And then, YouTube, of course, is I was very surprised to learn that apparently it's the most it's the has the largest audience for podcasts are on YouTube, which shocked me because I only use YouTube to watch videos. But apparently, lots and lots of people listen to podcasts on YouTube, and maybe they have it on in the background on their laptop while they're working, things like that. Um, but YouTube is a great option in this because you can make things and distribute them yourself without needing to go to a podcast distributor and get that kind of win them over and get that kind of support. So YouTube is another good option. So that is my talk. And I would love to hear your questions.
Hi, it's Susan.
Go
Susan
ahead.
Lester. Yeah, hi. I make documentaries, but film and television ones. So I have a kind of a technical question. When you're out in the field doing interviews, do you bring an audio person? Do you do the interviews with your own microphone? How do you do that?
Yeah, I do them myself. I think there are some public radio reporters at NPR who go out with producers and have somebody who's collecting all the tape for them.
Just the
But
audio I'm talking about when you're doing the interviews. What are
yeah, but
you
everything
using to do
I
the
do with
interviews?
yeah, all my interviews are done with on audio tape. So I don't I always am tape recording. I have a mic, headphones, a
Mhm.
digital recorder. And I record all interviews. I mean, it's very hard to make a radio story or a podcast story without tape. So there are, if someone isn't willing to go on tape, I don't go out to see them. I talk to them on the phone.
Mhm.
Um, and but anytime I'm working in the field, I am recording the interview, and I'm also recording ambient sound of the
Mhm.
place.
Oh, that's similar
You
to
know, I
other
think that,
documentaries.
yes, exactly. I mean, the what do you call that? B-roll? Something like that?
Well, the audio is not necessarily the B-roll, but the
Yeah,
interviews can be called B-roll, whatever. They're
right.
usually the sum and substance of a documentary. I was just curious process-wise, but then you bring that back and that all gets mixed in. That's very similar to other documentaries.
Yes, I bring so I record
Editing.
everything on a
Right.
very, small digital recorder. Come back, transfer it onto my laptop.
Hmm.
And until recently, until a few years ago, you had to transcribe all your audio and to know what you had. And that took hours and hours and hours. But now we have AI transcribing. And so within a matter of 10 minutes, I have a transcript of the tape that I've put into my laptop. And I used to use audio editing software like Pro Tools to cut my tape.
Hmm.
But nowadays we have this AI service that gives you a transcript, and then you can literally, like, if you're working in, it's as if you're working in a Word document, you can cut and paste and it'll cut the tape and move it into your script. So I can write and then take the audio and move it right into my script. It used to have
Hmm.
to go back and forth between like a Word
Sure,
document
sure.
and Pro Tools, but no longer. It's all integrated and super easy to use. It used to be that you needed some basic audio editing skills to make a radio story or a podcast, but no longer. It's all very, very easy.
Interesting. Thank you.
Hey, Nancy, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, well, thank you. This is really helpful. And I recently left New Jersey, so it's kind of funny and cheeky, I guess, that murder is still such a topic that really captivates people. And I always wonder, like, what's the positive alternative? If it's like spiritual wisdom and knowledge, and that's kind of just like a little tangent there. But I have my tiny mic, and so I have a couple of questions. So one, to just follow up on like the technical equipment side, is this like enough? I know probably in the sort of reporting that you're doing, you may need more backup tapes or just something else that might capture something. But on a topic that's more light and free form and in the moment, is simple equipment fine like that? Or
I
yeah.
think so. I think that um, it used to be that we only worked with professional equipment and it was not always so expensive, but certainly more than what like the consumer level would be. And I think that's just really changed, that the consumer equipment has gotten so good. And the sound that you can get just using your iPhone is amazing. Like it sounds pretty good. It's not what I do, but you could get away with literally just using the voice memo app on your phone. Um, so I think, yeah, I didn't, you picked it up and showed me, but I didn't quite grasp what it
Yeah,
was.
it's really simple. I'm sure a lot of people may have seen these. among influencers. I use this as a yoga teacher, and so we always when we record our virtual classes, but I've also seen people just record videos and
Yeah.
do some audio storytelling with these simple mics. It's not ideal, but in the spirit of like just removing more barriers, I guess. Okay, cool. Good to
Yeah.
know on
I
that.
mean, the whole standard has changed. I mean, it used to be, when I produced features for NPR, and I would schlep all over, and I was here in Jersey, covering New Jersey for them, and I would schlep all over the state to get people on tape and not have phone sound. And,
Mhm.
and nowadays, like, you could just have a Zoom call and record it, and it's perfectly good. And nobody's going to quibble with you. Like, no, engineer or producer is going to tell you, no, you can't put that on the air. Um, and there are a lot of shows that are recorded on Zoom, period. So, yeah, so I think the technology has just advanced so much, and the quality is so much better, that really, yeah, I would just try that. And if you're happy with how it sounds, then you've got your solution.
Okay. Um, I would love your perspective as well on like what would be is there like a good format or concept that maybe exists in the journalism world in terms of like how to ground an interview. When I think of like people like Joe Rogan, like I go in and out of listening to his podcast, and I think the reason why is I still am trying to figure out like what makes it such a good podcast, among all the other men that are the top podcasters, right, in the field. Which again, that's another thing that I'm observing and just wondering what are the elements there? And the key thing that just continues standing out to me, like as someone like Joe Rogan, is just an insatiable curiosity, which is great. Something that I think a lot of people have and could channel, but I wonder what else is there in terms of it's still on the back end strategically, it's still following some sort of principles or things to kind of still keep the narrative running, when we're thinking about, let's say, like a 25 or a 30-minute interview. I think that's been my challenge, is how do I, yes, very, I've done a lot of public speaking and events and such. And so I love and interviewing people in panels. And so I love being in that position, and I've done it so much that that's why a part of me wants to take that into a different format. But I think there's something there that I yet haven't really understood. Like, what is the refinement piece of like then really telling a nice story?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I think, I know I notice it all the time. Like, there are people who I think are good interviewers and who I really enjoy listening to. And then there are those who I don't necessarily. And I struggle with it myself, because whether it's an interview that I do that's tape recorded and I'm going to cut it up and use it in a story, or whether, like we do this show once a month with Governor Murphy, and I'm the host, and I struggle mightily with that show, like how to make it interesting, how to get him to, like, hold his feet to the fire and get him to answer my questions without sounding like too, like, that I'm badgering him and being obnoxious. So I think about this all the time, and I think curiosity is a big part of it. I wonder if you've ever listened to Fresh Air with Terry Gross,
Hmm.
and talk about, like, there are two great women interviewers on that show. It used to be just Terry Gross, and now she's got a co-host, because I think she's sort of semi-retired. And her co-host is Tanya Mosley, and the two of them are terrific interviewers. And I do think it has to do with a real curiosity and wanting to know what your subject has to say, and not having a ton of ego invested in looking smart and looking however you want to present yourself, like whatever it is, whether it's you wanting to be tough, or you wanting to be smart, or you're wanting to outsmart that person. I think it's always about sort of generosity, and curiosity and making sure that, really wanting them to tell their story. And you are the audience, you are the listener, and what questions might the listener have that they're going to want to know. And I think the other element is preparation. And I just think I hear it on, I think, like really well produced radio shows. The host sounds really smart because they're well prepared by their producers who are doing a lot of work, or they themselves are hardworking and really prepared. Um, Another really great interview show, I think, is Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and I think he's an interesting example because he knows a ton. I mean, because it's a local show, right? It's about New York. He's lived in New York his whole life. He's been a reporter, a journalist, and a show host for like eh, 45 years or something. And so he has all of that, but he also has this incredible generosity of spirit and where he just comes across as he authentically is as this very kind person who is just having a conversation with you. And so I've had this interesting experience of I've been on his show many times as a reporter guest talking about whatever it is I was covering. And I've done, many shows like that. And he makes it like for you finish that show and that interview and you feel like, wow, that was so good. I did so well. Like and it's him. Like I could do the same exact interview about the same material with a different host asking, slightly different questions, but essentially the same stuff and not be anywhere near as good or as comfortable. And there is like a secret sauce. And I think it really does come down to some of those things of curiosity, generosity, kindness, really wanting to help that person do the best job they can do to talk about what it is they want to talk about. So that's the
I love
best I
that.
can offer.
Yeah, thank you. One last follow-up on that. If, let's say, the end goal or product, sorry, the end, if let's say you want to produce like 30-minute clips, like you have a time frame in mind, when you schedule those conversations, do you like allocate for as much, I guess, time as the person you're interviewing is willing to give just to allow for that conversation to be very expansive, and then you just sort of trim as you go, or
Yeah, it depends on the situation. I mean, I would say, for me as a reporter, most of the interviews I do are very open-ended, and if the person has time, I will we'll just keep talking. And I would say the average length of most of the interviews I do is about 45 minutes. Um, Sometimes someone will say, I have 5 minutes, and that's all I have to talk to you. Often, like people in power will do that. Um, and so then you've got to be very strategic. I mean, it's certainly good going in to know how much time the person you're interviewing has. And then you just have to be very strategic, like, okay, these are the things I really need to find out or ask. So there's that. And then the other situation is one in which you're doing an interview that the amount of time is kind of, is built in, is scripted. So, Ask Governor Murphy is an hour. I know I've got the hour, but I run out of time every single month. It surprises me how quickly it goes and how few of my questions I get to. Um, but that's just, so sometimes what I'll do is we have segments where we have a break. We have two different breaks. So there are three segments. And so I'll know to start each segment with a question that I've prioritized that I want to make sure to get to, because I never know exactly where the conversation is going to go, how long he's going to take to answer it. He usually takes a really long time. And so, I plan it that way. So I know what my priorities are going into the show and what I really want to ask. And then I sort of make decisions as I go. And then, I've worked also because I've worked in radio news, we produce content at WNYC that goes into the national magazine shows, Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So you're getting the feed when you're listening here, you're getting the feed of from Washington, but we pull things out and put in local things. So when you hear like the host interviewing a local reporter, like Liz Kim, who's covering, Mayor Eric Adams in New York, big story this week. That's a local segment. And we know because we've pulled out it has to be exactly to the second the right amount of time because we leave the network and we meet the network back at their next story. We've pulled out a story of theirs and we're plopping in our stuff. And so that's a situation which we do, like the producers at WNYC do this every day. And so they are just, you get good at planning, like, okay, we've got 5 minutes. That's essentially four questions. And the format is not long-winded. It's like, you gotta answer those questions quickly because the person being interviewed and the host know we've got 5 minutes and we've got to get through all this stuff. So that's a situation in which, and we actually script those. I mean, the host is reading questions, and if it's an in-house interview with a reporter, we've scripted the answers for the reporter to answer. So, which I hate the way that sounds. It sounds fake, but it's kind of the reality of what we're doing. Um, so anyway, that I'm a little rambly, but that's kind of there's so many different interview situations in which the time constraints can be very different.
Thank you. It was very helpful.
Yeah, I have a question. Sort of has two parts, but it's really about like expectations that people have around podcasting and maybe false expectations and how you deal with them or how you would advise dealing with them. And so the two expectations I want to mention are going back to what you were saying about how the technology is a lot easier these days, it's more accessible. And I think that has led to a lot of a perception that it's really, really easy to make a good podcast or make good content. That, someone should be able to come up with an idea on Tuesday and then be able to like execute it on Wednesday and it's going to be a runaway success, easy peasy. And it's not really that simple, like to make a really good piece, like there is more to it. Like you were saying, really good interviewers are usually good because there's a bunch of research that happened, right, that prepared them. So how do you deal with communicating with decision makers around the perception that this is super, super easy, it should be really fast and cheap and also really good. And then the other sort of expectation I wanted to ask about was if you work in social media, right, everything is about things being really, really, really short, like 30 seconds, whereas podcasting, right, is long form. So, how do you kind of convince people that, yeah, there are audiences that are interested in long form? There, the people will pay attention for more than 30 seconds. So how do you how would you suggest dealing with like those two sort of expectations or misconceptions people might have around podcasting?
Yeah, great question. Um, oh, I love what you said about, yeah, it takes a long time and it's a lot of work to make a good podcast. Um, and while the technology has gotten very easy, that doesn't mean that, writing a 25-minute long form narrative with great tape is easy to do. So, um, yeah, and just, I mean, I think, some people have produced really great podcasts. I think my friend Matt Katz produced a podcast called Inconceivable Truth, and that's about his own discovery of his genealogy and that he wasn't who he thought he was. And he got a leave from WNYC and he he put the whole thing together in he'd been collecting tape for years because it was his own personal story, and he really thought it would make a great podcast someday. So for 4 or 5 years, he was collecting tape. So a lot of that had already been done, but he produced I think an 8 episode podcast that is excellent, in about 6 months. So, and it took me, it's kind of hard to measure because the pandemic was in the middle of it, but it took me roughly 2 years to make Dead End, although there was a period of about 10 months that I didn't work on it, that I was just doing news coverage around COVID during the first year of the pandemic. So maybe it took a year and a few months. Um, but that was a lot of and I'd done a bunch of the reporting, as I mentioned, the year before, but I still I needed to do a lot more reporting, and I needed a lot more tape to make it work. Um, so yeah, like a lot goes into these things. I taught a class on podcasting at Seton Hall a couple years ago, and I felt like the students, I think, really wanted to just wanted to turn on the microphone and talk with their friends and be funny. And I had a hard time disabusing them of this idea, and maybe that's fair enough. That's what they wanted to make. But I was like, you don't need to take a class to do that. Like, I want to teach you how to make something it takes more skill. And So I think there is kind of this idea, I agree with you, that you just turn on the mic and talk, and you're going to have a hit podcast like Joe Rogan. Um, so, and then convincing my bosses that I need the amount of time I need to do the work is also a challenge. Yes. And I'm not sure what to say about that. I'm working right now on a podcast about Bob Menendez, and it's taking longer than we thought. And it just takes time. It just takes a lot of time. So it's hard to convince editors that you need more time, but you just have to try, I guess. I don't really know what to say in terms of advice about that.
Thank you. This is so interesting. And I had one small question and one larger question. The small question is there an award, the equivalent of an Emmy for podcasts?
Um, Not really. I mean, not specific. There is a podcast award, but it doesn't have the it, it doesn't have, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's not as prominent
Yeah,
as an Emmy.
buzz.
Yeah, more than buzz. But prestige is the word I'm looking for. Um, I'm blanking on what it's called, but it's not that popular, it's not that important of an award, but podcasts do win awards on from the Peabody Awards and the DuPonts. Um, so those are two really big prestigious ones. And it used to be that it was like those were the big broadcast news awards for both TV and radio. And now podcasts really dominate uh, those. So, and now the Pulitzer is giving out awards to podcasts. So the one that I put at the top of the chat when we first started up tonight, Stolen, won a Pulitzer. Really great podcast. So yeah, those are the big ones.
Thank you. The second, what listening to you made me think about whether some books couldn't better be done as podcasts and whether that ever happens. One book I read, The Bishop and the Butterfly, it made me think of your podcast around the murder in New Jersey. And I just wondered, has anyone taken a book and turned it into a podcast?
Well, obviously there are audiobooks where people read books, but that's different.
Yeah.
Um, there must be, but I'm blanking. I can't think of an example of one. There has to be. That, yeah, but I can't think of one. It's a great idea. I mean, what typically happens is that good podcasts that are hits get purchased by Hollywood producers and made into TV series or movies. So that's one way that it goes. But I can't think of a book that where someone took a really great book and made it into a podcast. There's got to be one, but I'm just not
Mm.
thinking of it right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And actually, Kim just mentioned that Bad Blood about Elizabeth Holmes was a book made into a podcast. Um,
Okay, good
yes.
crowdsourcing.
Yes. And then there was a question earlier. Eliana asked, what are the most challenging and important parts of creating a successful podcast from your own experience?
Um, the most challenging part is getting somebody to pay you to do it. And so in my case, getting my employer to let me make a podcast. And then, I made a podcast and then trying to convince them to it took 2 years to convince them to let me make another one. So that's the hardest part. But also, you know, it's it's hard to figure out how to craft a narrative so that it really keeps people interested. And so, there's kind of um, this like it's become kind of almost cliched that people use cliffhangers at the end of every episode to get you to go click on the next episode and listen to that one. And certainly, that's what happens with every streaming series, right? Like they're built around leaving you with a cliffhanger at the end of an episode so that you go on to the next one. Um, and I'd say doing it well is easier said than done. I mean, it's just hard to figure out in the flow of a narrative how to create those cliffhangers. So I think just, developing a narrative that is propulsive, that keeps people interested, that and is not confusing. I find sometimes, I mean, I love that I can just hit back up and go back 15 seconds when I'm listening to a podcast, but at the same time, every time I have to do that, it annoys me. And I think, come on, you're not explaining this well if I have to back up and re-listen to it. So, and I think I worked with a really wonderful editor on Dead End who was just like, no, no, I can't understand this. You've got to explain it better. And so we rewrote, I mean, every episode we rewrote 6, 7, 8 times. And each time it was like just trying to explain these things in a way that people could follow along and not lose the thread. Also, often you're listening to a podcast while you're doing something else. And so that makes it even just more critical that you grab people's attention and you take them along on the journey and you break it down and explain it so that they can follow with you while they're doing the dishes. I think that's the challenge, that's the goal, and some succeed and some don't.
Thank you. And one last question in the chat. You mentioned earlier how you had multiple roles. You were both the host and producing. But Judalise has asked, what are some behind the scenes roles in podcasting for those who don't want to be on the mic?
So producing is a great role for someone who doesn't want to be on a mic. And whether you're working at a public radio station or working on a podcast. Um, and, I think a producer in the world of film and TV is a sort of higher level job and sounds like, oh no, no one's gonna hire me to be a producer because you think of that as like, oh, that's the guy at the top. But in radio and podcasting, producers are entry level jobs where you're doing research, you're pre-interviewing people, you're looking for people to be interviewed. Um, you're helping with the script sometimes, but mostly not. I mean, mostly it's like research, and finding people and or going out with the reporter. I said I usually just go alone and do my own recording, but if when I do have the opportunity to work with a producer, it's nice to have another pair of hands, another microphone going. Yeah, so producer is like the perfect job for somebody who doesn't want to be hosting or be on mic.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions, for joining us tonight, for providing insights into both your career and also just the different aspects of podcasting, like pitching, audience building, and all of everything else.
Did I convince you to go listen to a
I think you
podcast?
did.
My
Um,
job is done.
and thank you to everyone in the audience for your time and your participation and your questions. Have a great evening, everyone.